All right, I would love to welcome everybody to the discussion and forum. We have invited three very good speakers concerning the topic of freedom is not free, speech, fascism, and the university as the battleground is part of our discussion. And my name is Phil Rice, and I'm a physician, an emergency medicine physician that works up at North Shore Medical Center in Salem, part of the senior faculties of Harvard Medical School. And my co-moderator is Dr. Bruce Price, and we're going to kind of back and forth trying to get the discussion rolling and going. So the thing is that we're living in some very momentous times, and each of us feels it, and there's a question as to what do we do. And so part of this is to foster that discussion and talk about what the implications are of the battles around what have been happening on this university and other universities across the country, some of the attacks that have come down. So with that, what I would like to do is introduce our speakers. First up will be Sansara Taylor, and Sansara is an advocate for the new synthesis developed by Bob Avakian, a writer for Revolution newspaper at www.revcom.us, and a co-initiator of refusefascism.org. She's spoken eloquently and forcefully around the free speech movement, especially at Berkeley and elsewhere, where we've seen some of the stuff that's been on the newspapers and on TV. Secondly, we have Nicholas Whittaker, who is a class of 2019. And Nicholas was one of the initiators to develop the anti-Charles Murray protest that took place several weeks ago when they paraded this, I guess, human symbol of Confederacy before the campus. And he's a statue. With his ideas as dead and as old as the statues that we've seen being removed. So Nicholas led that, and we'd love to know from his perspective about this, the whole free speech, some of the questions he got into and how he led this and what kind of things went into developing that. And then the last speaker will be Timothy Patrick McCarthy. He's a lecturer in public policy and history and literary educational at Harvard, and he's also the program director for the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Kennedy School of Government. So with that, I wanted to make a couple of quick announcements. One is that there's going to be a questionnaire that we'd love everybody to fill out. They'll be passing it around concerning this program. And then two, there will be an announcement from a member of refusefascism.org that'll be speaking shortly afterwards. And last but not least, I do want Dr. Bruce Price to introduce himself.
As Phil said, Bruce Price is my name. Neurologist, Harvard Medical School, Chief of Neurology at McLean, and I work at Massachusetts General Hospital as well. Phil and I and several other people in this room 10 months ago now formed what we call Academics Against Fascism. We think the worst fears have indeed come true, and this is fascism American style. You should also know that I came to political awareness on this very campus in the beautiful and tumultuous years, 1967 to 1971. So maybe I can offer a little bit of experience, a tiny bit of wisdom, and help lead us forward a bit. And I'm haunted, and what drives me is this makes you study Germany in the 1930s. And what's haunting is the parallels. And if I can start with this, with a quote from Pastor Martin Niemöller, who many of you may know, who was a Christian pastor who was jailed by the Nazi regime, and in retrospect, years later, wrote the following. First, they came for the communists, but I wasn't a communist, so I didn't speak out. Then they came for the trade unionists, but I wasn't a trade unionist, so I didn't speak out. Then they came for the Jews. I wasn't Jewish. I didn't speak out. Then they came for the Catholics. I wasn't a Catholic. I didn't speak out. And then they came for me. And no one was left to speak out for me. What I see and fear and the fuel is that the intellectuals, the students, the academics in the 1930s gradually accommodated, accepted this as the new norm, didn't rise up in resistance. And what Pastor Niemöller reflected on as well is, what if thousands and maybe tens of thousands would have pushed back in the early 30s? You know, would that have changed history? And we think it just might have. So those are my tonal marks, why I'm here. And I'm really looking forward to this panel and the differences that we may have and the unity that we might forge. So let's get on with it. Thank you.
Just in case anyone's wondering, we will pass the mic around for questions afterwards. Okay?
Hi, everybody. I want to thank Academics Against Fascism for hosting this, and my fellow speakers tonight, and all of you for coming out. I want to start by pulling back the lens, and I want to say this nightmare of the Trump-Pence regime, this nightmare must end. The Trump-Pence regime must go. In the name of humanity, we must refuse to accept a fascist America. We're living in very dangerous times. A fascist regime, the Trump-Pence regime, is in power in this country. And every day it is wielding the full force of the most powerful superpower, the only superpower in the world, to impose a fascist America, a nightmare on humanity. No one but the people, all of us and people like us across this country, can stop this nightmare, can stop this regime. And I'm going to talk about why I think that is and what I think that means. And specifically, I want to say up front that refusefascism.org, who you will hear more from later and who I'm a co-initiator of, is calling for people to rise up and pour into the streets beginning November 4th, not just for one day, but day after day, in a movement of nonviolent political protest that grows from thousands to millions and does not stop until this regime has been driven from power. We say we need to do this in the name of humanity. And I want to say why I call this a fascist regime and why so much rides on what we do. I want to talk about Donald Trump standing in front of the United Nations and before the eyes of the world and threatening to totally destroy North Korea. Not just the regime, not just the nuclear arms and military bases, but the entire, destroy the country, 26 million people. Eminem was right when he talked about this as a nuclear holocaust in his recent rhyme. This is a genocide that he's threatening the world, in front of the world openly. It's a danger. Even Hitler didn't talk about openly carrying out a genocide this early in his regime. And he didn't carry something out on that scale, not in any way to minimize what he did, but to make clear what we're facing. Think about Donald Trump standing in front of a stadium filled with law enforcement, as he did not long ago in Long Island, and joking about how the police should not be too nice when they arrest people. He said, rough them up. He openly called for the kind of violence which has been rampant in this country, particularly by the police against black and brown people, the kind of violence that took the life of Freddie Gray, of Eric Garner, of Michael Brown, of Sandra Bland, of so many more, Rekia Boyd. We could spend all day talking about this. And he said he wants to bring this back. And then when NFL players courageously kneel or raise a fist during the national anthem to call attention to this racist police murder, this epidemic, Donald Trump stood in front of a stadium in Alabama and said, get those sons of bitches off the field, and called for them to be fired. Think of what this is sanctioning. The same way when he said he saw fine people marching with torches and Nazi slogans in Charlottesville. He saw fine people there. Think of what's being sanctioned and unleashed. Or think about the immigrants in this country living in terror. The deportations, more than 400 a day, breaking even Obama's record. About a month ago, targeted deportations and raids specifically aimed at sanctuary cities, breaking down doors and rounding up 500 people and disappearing them from their families and loved ones. This is a nightmare on a trajectory towards terrorizing and ethnically cleansing all 11 million undocumented people in this country. Or think about Donald Trump, bragging about grabbing women by their genitals, unapologetic, saying it's just a joke, boasting about sexual assault, and then coupling this with the Christian fascism of Mike Pence, that Christian fundamentalist, biblical literalist, who he and the movement he's part of took this regime coming to power as a green light, and in the first 3 months, this is not reported in the news either, in the first 3 months of this year, exactly 431 anti-abortion measures were introduced across this country to restrict women's access to reproductive freedom, to force women to have children against their will, and to reduce women to the status of incubators. This is a form of enslavement. Or think about Trump's genocidal response to the hurricane in Puerto Rico, or his attacks on Muslims, his attacks on LGBTQ people, his shredding of environmental protections, and so much more. Fascism is a qualitative change in the form of government. It is a blatant form of dictatorship that rules through open terror, unleashed by the state as well as by the mob that gets whipped up, and aims this terror against those who are deemed undesirable or enemies, or those who speak up and challenge what this fascist regime is doing. Fascism rips up and discards what have been traditionally protected democratic rights. It demonizes one group after another and closes down all the space from which to stand up and oppose it. This includes an assault on people's free speech. And I want to be clear, there's a lot of talk about an assault on free speech these days, and a lot of times you hear, scary stories about students protesting white supremacist, anti-scientific hacks like Charles Murray, and you are told this is the assault, a leftist assault on free speech. I want to say it is right and righteous for people to stand up and boo off the stage and drive off the campus a white supremacist like Charles Murray, or a Nazi idiot clown like Milo Yiannopoulos, who's been targeting Berkeley, and we could talk more about that. But the real crisis of speech and the real enemy of free speech is Donald Trump and his regime. It was Donald Trump who just a few days ago said that he wanted to revoke the license of NBC, and who complained that the press feels like they can write whatever they want, which is literally the definition of a free press. And the commander-in-chief of the most powerful country in the world is lashing out, saying their license should be revoked. Who gives them the right to write whatever they want? It was Donald Trump who said that people who burn the American flag, which is a protected form of speech, it went to the Supreme Court in 1989, Johnson versus Texas, that people who burn the American flag should be stripped of their citizenship rights. It was Donald Trump who stood in front of his stadiums of fans and supporters and said to everybody, I would like to punch that protester in the face. It was Donald Trump who whipped up and unleashed the kind of mob violence that is running rampant from Charlottesville, where white supremacists took the life of Heather Heyer, the kind of trolls and mobbing of people on the internet who speak out against this, the doxing of activists, and the targeting of professors. This includes people being threatened and having their invitations or even their professorships revoked. It includes a professor at Drexel University right now, George Ciccarelli, who has been suspended because of statements he's made about gun control on Twitter, and the targeting and the lies that were whipped up against him on Breitbart and Fox News, and the death threats and the trolls that are coming against him, and so he was removed from campus. It includes, we could go through, and I don't want to take too much time, listing the professors who've been silenced, the people who've lost their invitations, the people who have been censored and suppressed and terrorized. This is the crisis of speech. And it's a crisis that is aiming at closing down the space for people to think critically, for people to challenge what this regime is doing. And the university is a battlefield because campuses have always played a critical role in every movement of opposition and resistance, and students in particular. And there's a desire to chill out and suppress that now. And we could talk more about this. So I want to end by saying the title, Freedom is Not Free. This is absolutely true. Throughout history, people have had to stand up and struggle to end injustice. Freedom has never been free. People have had to put themselves on the line and take risks. And right now, part of the method of Trump's madness, people say all the time, oh, he's not acting presidential. Oh, he can't do that. That's not the way things are done. And then he does it anyhow. He threatens he threatens nuclear annihilation on Twitter. He makes up nicknames and insults other politicians. He lies habitually. He brags about sexual assault. He does all kinds of things you're not supposed to do. But the method to the madness is he is consciously ripping up the norms of this country, the legal norms, the political norms, the social norms, and remaking this country in a fascist way, and it's moving very rapidly. And the only way we're going to stop this is ourselves by going outside of the norms and not relying on the normal political channels. Waiting till 2018, waiting till 2020 is too long. Lives will be destroyed. And frankly, people have always had to go outside of the normal channels. That's what the Freedom Riders did. That's what the Civil Rights Movement did. That's what the gay liberation and queer movements did. That's what every struggle has had to do. So refusefascism.org, I will end with this, is a movement of people coming from very diverse perspectives who are recognizing the existential threat to humanity that this regime poses, and that it is on us, each of us, to stand together and to drive this regime from power. November 4th, we're mobilizing protests across the country to go into the streets, like I said, not just for one day, but day after day, growing from thousands to millions, drawing forward all the people in this country who are sick at heart, who are outraged, who are terrorized, and who are, frankly, paralyzed right now, to stand up and not stop until this regime has been driven out in the name of humanity. It is our responsibility to refuse to accept a fascist America. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Whittaker?
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm really honored to be here with such outstanding heroes and incredible people, and I'm overwhelmed. Thank you so much. And I guess in thinking about my place here at this event and just in this larger, the movement which I hope this event stands for, I think my job is to provide you all with a kind of on the ground, we've heard what's going on around this entire country, around the world, the macro level. And I think it's really important to keep in mind the way that this is trickling down, the way that this is affecting the way I as a student move about, the way I as a young adult move about the world, the way I as a black man move about through the world. Yeah, I just think that's what I'm here to do. So I'll begin by starting with the Charles Murray protest. For context, if anyone is unfamiliar with Charles Murray, he is a sociologist, a scientist, who has basically advocated for a form of hidden eugenics. He's argued that the social stratification in the United States and in the world is due to a large part to intelligence, and that therefore the demographic differences that this wealth stratification is built upon are due to IQ differences. And basically that's saying that black and brown people are inherently less intelligent than white people, and women are inherently less intelligent than men. And he has published multiple texts arguing this. The Southern Poverty Law Center has declared him a white nationalist, and many have debunked his academic contributions, his moral character. He's universally rejected. Harvard decided to invite him a month ago, to be more precise, the Open Campus Initiative, which is an organization on campus I'm happy to discuss more when we get back to question and answer, invited him to campus to push the limits of free speech is their proclaimed motive. They invited him to discuss elitism in Trump, the buzzwords, all of them. And so, they made sure to erase his blatant white supremacy and white nationalism from this event. Not because they didn't want people to notice, but because they wanted to see what they could get away with. And I emphasize that because I think that's a really important point about the battle of free speech on campuses. I have come to realize that on a campus like this that proclaims its liberal values, it's very clear that the reason why I don't feel safe here, and the reason why people don't feel safe here, is because we share campuses with people who want to push things, who want to see how far they can go. And I think this is kind of what the trend has always been and will always be. This is why we get into situations like this. It's not because everyone believes these high ideological principles. I don't believe Trump and Pence have ideology. I don't think they have beliefs. I think this is fundamentally about power and about seeing how far you can go and how far you can push it and how far your body or your sex or your social position allows you. So happy to discuss more about that again. But so to go back to Charles Murray, so he was invited to campus. And the Black Caucus, one of the endorsers for this event, we're new. We are a formalized branch of the student government at Harvard. We're brand new. Caucuses have never existed before. It's something we pushed for in the past 2 years. And basically we saw that marginalized voices were being systematically disenfranchised and ignored in not just student government, but in the administration at this campus, in campus discourse, just in general. So we saw this vacuum and we decided to fill it with these minority caucuses. So we decided to host a counter event to the Murray talk. And the way we framed that is we had a protest event at the beginning in which I and a couple other students led about 250 students, Cambridge residents, many of you were there, which is wonderful, and faculty members who came. We asserted ourselves loudly and proudly. We let everyone who was in line to see this man know exactly what they were endorsing. After that, we moved into a building and we hosted an event, a panel with multiple incredible faculty members from the college that also had attendance of about 200 people. It was an outstanding event. There are not spaces like that on this campus. There are not spaces where people who truly believe in really radical protest and truly radical social change gather together and feel empowered to share a space. And I pause on that because I think that is one of the most important jobs of protest on a university, for me as a student. Protest has two jobs. The first is to achieve a desired result, a desired political social result, which is obviously critical. But then the other equally critical part is the empowerment of voices. And I don't think that's discussed as much. There's something really, really viscerally important about the people who are marginalized, who are oppressed, standing up and speaking, not just receiving rights or attention, but actually claiming it, standing up and taking what they deserve. And I think that is where we see a lot of the differences among ideological divides in this country. I think that the reason why, in a lot of ways, center-of-left liberalism has failed, communities like mine, is because you have to ask who's up front leading the charge. Is it the black bodies? Is it the femme bodies? Is it the queer bodies? Is it the people who are personally invested and who need this event not just to make sure that they are able to vote or they receive their constitutional rights, but so that they can rest assured in their own humanity? Sarah said it beautifully. This is an existential crisis. It's not just about the social, political, economic realities. It's about a dehumanization and the robbing of my voice and the voice of people like me. And that's what protest is. And that's what protest is on the university. We are young. We are just beginning to understand what this world has in store for people like us. And so we're faced with an existential crisis. How will we respond? What will we do? Some of us are forced to leave here and silence ourselves and to allow our voices and our humanity to be robbed and to stick with the status quo or stick with lukewarm social change that refuses to actually empower the voices that are in need. And then I think what I would love to see is if people like me are able to leave this university not only confident that they can change the world, but confident that they themselves have a right to speak, they themselves have a right to be heard, and their humanity can be, even if this world never changes, even if I have to continue to live in this police state where I am constantly in danger, I will rest assured knowing that at the very least I have stood up and asserted myself and claimed my humanity. And that's what protest has helped me to do, and that's what I think protest can critically do for students. Thank you so much.
Okay, we get to hear from Professor Tim McCarthy.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I must say, just got to have a moment here, because Nicholas was my student in a course on American protest literature, and I claim no responsibility for any of that. I just learned something from you. So that piece about creating space for voices, that protest is not just about the actions in the line to achieve the desired ends of the protest itself, but creating spaces for people to lead and to be heard is a really important intervention. So I just want to mark that, brother. Good on that. It's wonderful to be here, and Sansara, thank you for that epic overview of what we are up against, because we are certainly up against a lot, and the list and the way that you're connecting the dots on all of that is really, really, really important as we have these conversations and debates and interventions in spaces like these. So let me just say, I'm going to touch briefly on the three pieces of the post-colon title of tonight's event. And academics, when they get together, always have to have colons and pre-colons and post-colons. So let me take my direction from the title itself and talk for a little bit about speech, a little bit about fascism, and a little bit about the university as a battleground. The first thing I want to say, and I said this at an event that I think where Academics Against Fascism was founded, correct? Last year. My God, it's not even been a year. Oh my God. Whew, Lord, it feels like it was 15 years ago. But not a year ago, we were gathered at MIT for a really spectacular event at which I was also invited to speak. And it was a resistance teach-in the night before the inauguration of the 45th President of the United States. And many of us were obviously deeply concerned about the prospects of that, the reality of that, and yet we had no idea exactly what was to come. And so, in fact, I think I literally said we have no idea about what is to come. And now we do have some idea about what has transpired. And at that event, I did something that I've been doing in an ongoing way ever since the election, certainly, and even before that, which is to remind us that despite the fact that the founding of this nation was rooted in a white supremacist project that manifested itself most dramatically in the enslavement of African peoples and also in the settlement and colonization of indigenous lands and the displacement of indigenous peoples and genocide in some respects as well. That despite the fact that our national experiment was rooted in that kind of white supremacist project of dislocation and dehumanization and so forth, and despite the fact that our founding documents were authored and debated and written and placed into circulation by folks who were presiding over that project, there are in those founding documents, and I'm a historian who teaches at a school of government, and so I often find myself in the weird place of being a left-wing person who's quoting constitutions and declarations of independence. But I want to remind us that in the Constitution itself, there's this little nook and cranny of radicalism that gives us something that I think is really important and that relates to the topic at hand tonight, which is the First Amendment. It's the First Amendment to a Constitution that's deeply imperfect, authored by people who are even more imperfect and problematic. But it says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. That's the most radical thing in the Constitution, in an otherwise very conservative document. And yet it is something that I have reread regularly, if not daily, ever since the election of Donald Trump, because I think that the freedom in terms of the speech that delineates, that guarantees and promises, even though it has not always guaranteed or lived up to it, the fact that that's written down, that we have that to go to, and that we have those rights, is radical and important, especially in times like this. That said, I also am a historian not of the Founding Fathers or of even the founding documents. I'm a historian of American radicalism, and I'm a historian of social movements. And so I understand the truth of the first part of the title of tonight's thing, that freedom is not free. That freedom, though guaranteed and enumerated, has never been something that is freely given. It has been something that has had to be demanded and fought for and struggled for over and over and over again throughout history, whether you're talking about the people in the founding of the nation who were left out of all of the political liberties of the nation at its founding, and every single social movement of marginalized peoples who have risen up over time in this country and elsewhere have gone back to the incomplete realization of those founding promises and sought to fight for those freedoms to be more real than they were at the time when they were just words. But I also want to say that just as freedom is not free, neither is freedom equal. And that's something that I think we have to keep in mind in this current climate when we're talking about speech. That some people have platforms that are more elevated than others. Some people are invited to speak at universities and elsewhere by powerful and privileged folks in the university, and others are invited to speak at universities by far less privileged and powerful people. Some people have bigger audiences and higher priced honorariums and higher social positions in society. And so I think it's important for us as we're thinking about speech as it relates to freedom that we also think about the freedom of speech as being an inegalitarian reality, where even though we can all claim to have that freedom, we are given it, we enjoy it, we are denied it in unequal ways. Mario Salvo, who was one of the founders of the free speech movement, I'm sure many of you in this audience are familiar with him. Sometimes I have to teach people who these people are. I don't think this is an audience where I need to introduce you to Mario Salvo. Mario Salvo, of course, was the leader of the free speech movement at Berkeley, and he said this in a famous speech on Sproul Plaza on December 2nd of 1964. He said, "There is a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part, and you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from running at all." And those words from 1964 are as relevant today as they were in that moment. And that leads me to the second point I want to make about fascism, that oftentimes, especially in left circles, we use words like fascism and these kinds of words very freely, and sometimes I think too freely, since we're talking about freedom. But Chimamanda Adichie wrote a piece in the New Yorker right after the election. She said, it's time to start using the words that speak the truth of what we're talking about. It's time to speak specifically about what we're saying. And I don't think that fascism in this moment is a word that is being misused. Orwell, who was no fan of the word fascism, said that fascism, when you boil it down, is bullying. Tim Snyder, in his recent book, which has become another one of my kind of secular Bibles in this moment, his book on tyranny, where he draws from his deep knowledge about the history of the Holocaust and authoritarianism and fascism in Europe between the two world wars. And he warns us in all of these ways about the forces that are gathering, the ones that Sinsara gave such specificity to in her remarks. But he talks about fascism as being a regime of political repression where attacks on institutions are prevalent, where bullying of vulnerable groups is an everyday practice, where an anti-egalitarian sentiment or ideology is at play, where one party is in control, where the people fall in line, where there's a strong leader and a violent state that is attempting to submit or subordinate ordinary folks into submission. And I don't think that we can look with our eyes wide open at the world that we're living in now, and in particular here in the United States, and shy away from that kind of designation. And so we are definitely, I think, in the early gathering stages of an emerging fascist regime that we have the power to stop in this moment in history. It is not yet fully formed. It is forming. It is not yet fully emerged. It is emerging. It is not yet fully evolved. It is evolving. And we have the power, individually and collectively, to stop it before it goes any further. We were talking, Sincera and I were talking earlier, about the ways in which this regime, this Trump-Pence regime, is engaged in an everyday practice of assault on us. That every day, whether it's a Twitter feed or a news feed or just an everyday walking around in the world, feels like an assault on our bodies, on our lives, on ourselves, on our dignity, on our values. And when we are constantly under assault, we are more vulnerable than we would be if we were not under assault. And so that vulnerability, that sense of paralysis, that anxiety that we feel all the time, if not outright terror for our physical safety, is something that makes that regime, makes it easier for that regime to absorb us, to suppress us and subordinate us, and we must stand strong in the midst of it. The university is one of the places in this moment that can be a place of battle and also a place of resistance. And this university, I'm happy to say, is showing signs of being able to rise up in a strong resistance. I have been around here not as long as Bruce has been, but I got here in '89 and was here till '93, so we were a generation apart, and now we have another generation before us. That's one of the things about being at a university long enough, is that you see these generations pass. And so I came of age here in the midst of the AIDS crisis and the anti-apartheid struggle and the student solidarity movements. I emerged out of here in graduate school in the labor movement and the anti-police brutality movement in New York in the 1990s, back when we were fighting Charles Murray over the bell curve. Right? When he came here, I said to you, I said, that brother's still alive? Right? I couldn't believe he wasn't dead. I said that to you. I was like, Jesus Christ, we were protesting him 20 years ago. He was still stupid and silly and totally racist. So I came of age in that moment and have been at Harvard on and off since 1998. When you talk about the bullying and the surveillance of faculty, I was the only Harvard faculty member who was blacklisted by Lynn Cheney in the fall of 2001 after 9/11 because I went on record being opposed to the war in Afghanistan before it started, when I was party of One Your Table's Ready at faculty meetings. So I know what it's like to be placed under surveillance. I know what it's like to get death threats. I know what it's like for people to try to silence you. And I am still here, and I have never been silent. And that is one thing. I don't want a trophy for that. It's how I live my life. I don't need applause, thank you, but I don't need that. But what I do know is that universities can also be places where we can find our strength, where we can find our bravery, where we can claim those freedoms. As vulnerable as I have been for my political views, and as vulnerable as I still am for being a queer person on this faculty, in solidarity with black and brown and other people of color on this faculty, as vulnerable as I am because I will never have tenure on this faculty, yet I speak. Because we must, and we must teach, and we must work with whomever is here that is willing to join with us, and it's often students. Often junior faculty, not senior faculty. I'll put that out there too. Right? It's amazing how brave people don't get when they get tenure around here. But this place is both a battleground where these fights are being had, but it's also a place, I think, of resistance. And we've seen it here recently. The resistance school, which my students at the Kennedy School have started, was a thing that they were not happy about over at the Kennedy School when it started. There were attempts to deny them rooms and deny that they were part of the Kennedy School, and yet the students persisted, and they created this thing that is now happening in 1.0 at Berkeley and 2.0 here, toggling back and forth as a training ground for a new movement of resistance against the Trump-Pence regime. Nicholas talked about the Charles Murray counter-protest and the protest of his event, which was a beautiful, beautiful spectacle and intellectual and political event. My students at the Kennedy School, I was away giving a lecture. My students at the Kennedy School were the ones who planned the protests against Betsy DeVos when she came to speak in the forum, unfurling those banners about white supremacy and sexual assault and challenging one of the people in this country who's at the top of our power regime when it comes to education in the very place that she had been elevated and invited, and they did that spectacularly well. My colleagues recently were arrested in an act of nonviolent civil disobedience, shutting down Massachusetts Avenue in the wake of Donald Trump repealing the DACA program that Obama put into place only late in his term. We've seen over and over and over again here in recent months examples of the power of resistance and the power of organizing and the power of claiming with a full throat and full bravery and an unwillingness to be silent those freedoms of speech and assembly and so forth that are rooted in the very founding of the country. And so when we think about what it means to, what our responsibility is at this moment in time, it's to claim those freedoms with a full throat. It's to resist fascism wherever it is. And it is to be brave and as brave as we can for as long as we can until we fall silent for the last time. And until then, at least for me at least, I promise that I will not be silent no matter what forces are arrayed against me attempting that to happen. And I'll stop now.
Okay, I want to thank our speakers for their introductory remarks. And I know this has generated quite a few thoughts in everyone's mind. So I wanted to open it up to discussion. And one of the things I'll start with is a question of my own, where we meet different people and different groups that are fighting for different issues. And there's a view towards fighting on the local level for their particular issue, and with the thinking that this is more winnable than taking on the whole thing. In other words, can you really take it on wholly, or do you have to take it piece by piece? And so people have fought vociferously to say, no, we got to stay local and focus on this one little area, whether it be we're going to focus on the post-incarceration treatments, et cetera, to keep them out of jail, et cetera. Focus on the DACA stuff, but can't relate to some other aspects. And there's some others that are saying, no, you can't do it that way. You have to take on the whole thing. So I would like to throw that out to the speakers as to how they would answer that particular viewpoint of gotta stay local.
Want to just go in order?
Let's go the opposite order.
Opposite way? Okay. All right, good. So it's a really good question, and I hear this a lot from folks whose work is located within the political system, the electoral system. A lot of people that I know who in addition to some of the other more radical and progressive organizing work they do. They also do Democratic Party stuff or third-party stuff, and are really worried about the political party dynamics in the country. We spend a lot of time talking about that at the Kennedy School. And so I've heard that over and over again as a mantra, that we have to go local, in terms of local and state is where it's at, because the Democrats are out of power and so forth. I don't spend a lot of my time fretting too much about that. I feel like that's work that other folks are doing that I'm not as keen to do. But I think that, I think my response is I think we have to do both and rather than either or. Because I think that there are ways in which the local work that we do to organize, to create spaces in our institutions and communities for other voices to emerge, to claim those free spaces and brave spaces is really important. Right? And there are local things that we can do in a city or in a town or in a community or a state that can actually fundamentally change the way that people live their lives and are able to live their lives. But I don't think you can ever take your eye off the bigger picture. I don't think we can ever not think about systems and structures and the macroscopic stuff that Sansara was talking about. And so for me, it's always been a toggling back and forth between those things. What do my people need in the communities within which we live, and the movements within which we are doing our work at the grassroots, and then also how do we fight the machine? And I remember thinking about this within the context of the anti-war movement, the peace movement. I went to all of the big protests in New York and Washington and everywhere, and I did that work very nationally and internationally when after 9/11, and it got me into a lot of trouble. But I also, when I went to North Carolina, stood with the Quaker ladies who stood outside the post office every Friday at 5 and bore witness to peace and against war, and went to community meetings where people were organizing locally in their own ways. And so for me, going back and forth and trying to figure out a both-and strategy for that political work is really important. It's also exhausting. We can talk more about that, but that's what I would say to that.
Yeah, I think I agree for the most part. I think that, again, I'll try to keep it with the student perspective. I think one of the concerns that runs through our mind when we have decided that we want to commit our lives to this battle, is what the most effective thing to do is. And, there's a reason that people who go to incredible law schools like Harvard Law don't often go and do public defense work. They often work on the macro level. They don't think it's as important to work on the ground. I fundamentally disagree. I do think that for two reasons. One, it is undeniable that real change happens on the ground, and real change happens on those local state levels. And there's also the point, as Tim mentioned, that this is where it is easy to get lost in those large battles. But it's these small battles, that a small protest that I organized at the university level, that's where I claim my ownership of my voice. But it is undeniable that work is useless alone. Like, we can't do this little by little, I don't think. And the hard part, this isn't much of an answer, but it's we have to figure out a way to do it organically, to do both organically. It can't be not only either or. The both and has to work together. It has to be in tandem. There cannot be two separate battles going on at once on different levels.
So I guess I wanted to make an analogy maybe to begin, which is that, there's local, there's national, there's international. Where to proceed from? Well, I think, if you were somebody who had a terrible disease and you went, or something was ailing you, you didn't know what it was, and you went to a doctor, and the doctor would study what's going on. Where is it rooted? If it turns out you have, an infection of the skin in your arm, then you treat it locally. If it's something deeper that's spread throughout your whole circulatory system, then you have to treat that. It's a global systemic problem. You actually have to first diagnose what you're up against. What is the problem you're confronting? And some things are local issues. Some things are interpersonal issues. Something, people live in the world that has different layers to it. You interact with the world on different levels. But I think right now we have to confront that we are living through a moment that is, look, not everybody, every generation throughout human history, tens of thousands of years, has inherited certain conditions of life and certain structures of society and has interacted within those structures and impacted on the way it will be for future generations. You always are putting your imprint on what's happening. But not every generation and not every moment lives through moments that literally shape the course that the next period and epoch in history is going to pivot on. And I think there's no getting around. Right now, we live in a world where there's one superpower. And it has military bases, over 100 military bases around the world. And it is a country that was built up on slavery and white supremacy and has deeply entrenched from the state, from the police, from the structures, from the institutions in schools, from the culture, from the media, deeply entrenched white supremacy that's being viciously reasserted right now. We live in a country that, it wasn't that long ago that women were considered, that you wouldn't see women on a panel in the audience. You wouldn't see women in the legal sphere, in the public arena at all. Before birth control, women were stuck at home. Their lives were foreclosed. They were literally, basically property of their husbands and their fathers before that. This is something that has changed, and there's a huge, violent backlash against it. That's why I don't believe Trump got elected because people say he got elected. Can't believe he got elected in spite of his comments about grabbing women by the pussy. I'm sorry, he got elected because of that. That was what he wrote on, the revengist white supremacy, the revengist misogyny, the revengist America first chauvinism. So we're living in a moment where that, pardon the really frustrating pun, that trumps what's happening on a local level. That shapes and conditions every local battle. I can't even tell you how many exchanges I've had. I'll try to be brief. In the last 3 days, people who are organizing against the Muslim ban was scheduled to go into effect tomorrow. And they're mobilizing buses to go down to D.C. to stand up against it. And fortunately, for the time being, this was yet again blocked by the courts. But Trump has said, I'm going to impose this no matter what. And he keeps coming back, even though it's been blocked now, I think 4 times. He keeps trying to reassert it. And people were saying, when it first got instituted, people flooded to the airports. They shut it down. It was unprecedented. It was beautiful. And then now it's going into effect, and almost nobody knows it. There's no big outcry, and they were saying, we're trying to fill the buses. We can't fill the buses. This is on every front. People's best efforts are being absorbed by this regime that is barreling ahead. And it's endangering people all over the world. All over the world. Muslims everywhere, people who live in countries that will be flooded by the sea level risings and the intensifying of the storms as this regime is gutting all the regulations on the environment and accelerating global climate change. I won't list the rest of these things. My point is we have to proceed by diagnosing what is the problem we're up against. And I don't think if we look soberly, if we look honestly, what we are up against is a macro. It's a regime problem that is threatening the world. And if we don't, all of us, lift our sights, I know it's easier to fight a local battle. It feels safer to fight a local battle, but that safety is illusory. It's illusory because, one, at best, you're saying to hell with the people of the world, to hell with those who are first being targeted. First they came for the communists, whoop, not me. Then they came for the Jews, oh, not me. That's what you're repeating if you go local right now. And we can't do that. We have a responsibility, and frankly, I really agree, I'll end with this, I really agree with the point that this regime is not fully consolidated. There is time to stop it. But there's not a lot of time, and we don't have a lot of time for illusions and playing it safe and looking the other way when it's plain as day in front of us if we confront it. And that's why, and I'll talk more about this too. I'm going to keep talking about November 4th, and people need to come out, and we need to bring our friends out, and we need to bring the faculty out and the students out, and people across the country, and spread the word. We have to stop this regime in the name of humanity. That's the actual diagnosis.
So may I chime in with my
Yes.
my 2 cents and all my wisdom?
Yeah.
Because a lot of it, yeah, and so obviously the physician tumor excise it, damn it, analogy works for me as a scientist. The word radical works for me because radicals simply look for root cause analysis, don't we? Yeah. And look at the broad picture, not just the local infection. But a lot of the stories, I think, involve personal transformation. So even in the early 60s, when the civil rights movement was nascent, a few people pushing back against a mighty powerful establishment. As I recall, Martin Luther King said at one of these meetings, we have to all be certifiably insane to do what we're doing. Well, look at history.
Yeah.
Then comes the mid-60s and so forth, and it was single groups, initially civil rights, women's liberation, obviously anti-Vietnam, and the beginning of climate change. But the true coalescence took place when everyone felt any outrage was their outrage. That we are global citizens, and damn it, the life of a Vietnamese child means every bit as much as the life in this country. So that's, to me, when the coalescence and the steam built around all these things, and suddenly from thousands to hundreds of thousands to literally millions in this country and worldwide, we really pushed back and scared the bejesus. The foundation shook temporarily. And that's obviously what we're needing to do now. So there's another famous statement by General Westmoreland, which I was reminded about the other day, the military commander of the Vietnam War. And it's a compliment to the movement back then when he said, we did not lose the Vietnam War in Vietnam. We lost the war in Berkeley.
That's right.
That's the power that we have. Finally, I think we're losing right now. Do the scorecard. We're friggin' losing. Aren't we?
Yeah.
What do we have to do? What do we put together to really build? And I would suggest that November 4th is one such action.
Here, use the mic.
Long before the free speech movement, we were organizing at UC Berkeley. And I've been involved in the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement, and I'm involved in a lot of local movements, in the environment and anti-war movements. But it doesn't seem like this group has reached those local movements because nobody's talking about November 4th.
Yeah.
And so, to me, it seems like I totally agree with the analysis. I think you have to work on local levels, but you also have to work on this macro level. It is definitely a moment that we have to grab onto. And I've been in the streets, but I think the women's movement was extraordinary. That showed a moment after the election, but it was very specific and targeted and led by black women, actually, both in Washington and here. And so it doesn't seem like I know a lot of people, friends who never come out for anything else, but they came out for that. But I can't see them coming out for November 4th because it's too amorphous. It seems like there hasn't been a lot of groundwork done. And so I think we need, long before November 4th, a strategy meeting in each major city, like Boston, New York, California, cities that we know have forces on the ground and movements that have been developing over time. We need a common strategy because in Berkeley, going back to '64, it started out with a handful of people, and by the end we had tens of thousands of people. But it was contained. It was also a moment, but it was contained and it spread out from the university.
Yeah.
So we don't have that kind of containment, and we don't. I think we have the ability to be in touch with different movements, but I don't see. It hasn't yet happened, and November 4th is just around the corner.
Yeah.
So I can't see quite the larger vision of how, because to even create a movement of getting that many women out took, it actually was very short. It was like a month. But it was a one-shot something.
Yeah.
And so your vision is, like in the Depression, a workers' movement.
Let me respond to what you're raising, because I think it's important. The vision of November 4th and the November 4th movement to drive out the Trump-Pence regime, which, if the word is not out enough, and I know that's true, we should go to work on changing that. The vision of it is mass, nonviolent, sustained political protest that begins with many thousands across this country. There are protests planned in at least, actually more than a dozen cities across the country. New York, LA, Chicago, Los Angeles is LA. I know that. Here in Boston, San Francisco, Atlanta, Houston, Austin, around the country, but more people need to know. And the idea is that, look, we did do the Women's March. A lot of us participated. It was beautiful. It actually showed the depth of outrage. But it was one day. And this is the character of fascism. It can absorb individual acts of resistance and then barrel ahead. And a lot of those people are not all thrilled with what's happening, but the normalization is having an effect. People are learning to go on with their lives, and they're becoming acclimated to things that they never thought they would tolerate. And it's getting worse every day, as Timothy was talking about. So the point of November 4th is you actually disrupt that. You jam that. You bring people out, and it starts with thousands, but then you stay. It's day after day. And it's not begging somebody in power, hey, we're out here. We hope you notice we don't like this. It's asserting, we're here and we're not stopping. And by being in the streets day after day, you are stirring and calling forward all those people who are on the sidelines, who are waiting to see, waiting for 2018, waiting. And frankly, we were talking about this earlier too, a lot of people feel paralyzed. They feel overwhelmed. They feel powerless. That's part of why they go for what seems like more realistic local struggles, which frankly are not that realistic. So the point is, everybody, throw in everything you can in the next 2.5 weeks and get the word out. We have this incredible pamphlet. I was going to bring this up. There's 2 resources I really want to promote. This is one of them. This is a pamphlet that actually documents. It has the call for November 4th. It's a great poster in the middle. And then it documents on 7 panels all the crimes that this regime has done that people don't know, that's being papered over, not being reported. It arms you with the facts, and it helps people understand, because people will act. Why do they act? Because they're going to see, the more they understand the necessity, the more they understand what we're confronted with, the more they're going to see that going along with what we've been going along with is not sufficient. So you come out on November 4th and you bring your friends and you spread the word, and that can help break this feeling of isolation and call others forward and sound the alarm. And the point is, I don't know how many people followed this, but last year, towards the end of last year and then early this year, there was a movement, which history never repeats itself exactly, and different parts of the world are different, but there's a model here that's worth learning from. In South Korea, people went into the streets over and over and over, and it grew from thousands to millions, and it lasted weeks and then months, and they didn't stop until their president was driven out. They created, through their determination, a political crisis where that president was forced from power. And that is possible in this country. The Women's March actually gave an indication of some of the depth of the unprecedented outrage. But that has to be organized into something that is aiming at dislodging the whole regime, because this regime will not be reasoned with. It will not be bound by, kept in its place or beaten back. It has to be dislodged, and we have to have that aim, and we have to sustain that. And we have to call others into that. So I recommend this for people, and we have flyers here. We have a form we sent out for people to sign up. There's a lot of work to do, and there are organizing meetings coming up. I also want to recommend, and this is where I recently heard this example of Berkeley is where the Vietnam War was lost. There was an incredible talk and presentation given by Bob Avakian, the chairman of the Revolutionary Communist Party, on what we're facing, on the Trump-Pence regime must go, This nightmare must end. A better world is possible. And this is available at www.revcom.us, and he's talking about the need and the basis and the how we can drive this regime out on November 4th. I really recommend it for people. You know, I compressed a lot into 10 minutes of my opening, but there's a lot that people need to understand, and this is a very deep case that's made. It's a resource. I recommend people watch it, spread it, share it, and then we do the work together to get organized from our different perspectives to stand up and launch this movement.
Hi. So I'm actually a representative of Resist Marxism, which is actually a counter-response to a lot of what's going on here. As you can see, the difference between kind of the groups that these people associate with and what I associate with, we believe that free speech is the way to debate ideas and not to violently shut people down or beat people down. I want to encourage people, I guess, to actually talk to people who you vehemently disagree with. Because me personally, I disagree with Marxist thoughts, social justice, which is kind of an idea of Marxism, and just groups that want to promote violence. I mean, you talk about the revolution, and when you look at the history of communism, fascism has always been a product of the left. It has never been a product of the right. When you looked at Nazi Germany, he was a National Socialist. So socialism and communism has always been a part of that. So why do you think that communism, according to Bob Avakian and your Revolutionary Communist, the New Communism book, I haven't read it yet, I'm interested in reading it, but why do you think that this is the solution as opposed to democratically trying to elect better leaders? Because communism has been a terrible idea in the 20th century. It's killed over 100 million people, and you can say, oh, capitalism, oh, it's killed, whatever. But the thing is those people that lived under those communist societies, they didn't have a choice. They were put into labor camps because the economy was failing. So I guess my question is, what do you expect the new regime to be? Bob Avakian? Why do you think you're so right when we look at the history of democracy as opposed to communism? And I guess that's overall, because from what I'm seeing, I think that there's this ideological echo chamber here in this room and throughout society where we just need to have discussions, not try to fight each other about who's right and who's wrong.
What was your name, brother? Oliver. How you doing, man? Thank you for that. So, a couple things I want to say. First of all, the characterization that you just made about all of us, I just want to take a moment to say that I'm not advocating for the violent of anything. I'm a pacifist. I'm come from a Catholic social justice tradition for working class folks from upstate New York, and I have never advocated violence for anything. No. You said your thing, I'm gonna say, you mischaracterized me. So I'm just being very clear about that. So I'm a pacifist. I'm also not a communist. I think you're eliding a lot of distinctions between various expressions of communism, various expressions of socialism that have taken place over time. There are expressions of communism and socialism that go back to indigenous societies in antiquity, all the way through today. And so, in the interest of, one of the things that happens when we are in ideological battles is that certain kinds of differentiations, which are important to anybody who cares about history, get flattened. And so I think there's a little bit of that in what you're doing here, not just on the level of grouping everybody who's in this room together into some kind of violent extremist cabal, which no. I'm just responding to what you said. You can, and so I'm pushing back gently. The other thing is, I spend my life in debate. I spend my life in classrooms where we debate everything, every day, in every way. And that's my job, for which I'm lucky to get paid a living wage at a university that doesn't yet do that for everybody who's employed here, and that's movements that I've been involved with nonviolently, too, for the last 25 years. And so I think it's important for us to be careful about, A, the way that we caricature with a broad brush entire groups of people or rooms of people at the same time that we're trying to call for a kind of civil discourse about differences that actually exist in the very room that you've mischaracterized as being of one mind. And so I'm just, yeah. Of course it's social justice. I'm a social justice Catholic, a pacifist, a nonviolent peacemaker, and also a historian who understands the distinctions that you're eliding are actually historically important.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I think I'm a 19-year-old college student. I've never advocated for the violence of anything. Yeah, and I guess to second that point, this is a university, and while we should be careful about sanctifying universities and constructing them as some fantasy of like true discourse, I think it's safe to say that discourse happens here. Discourse happens here. I've been lucky enough to be in Tim's class, and yes, I'm a philosophy student. I believe in the power of conversation and the power of discourse, and that is the only way the truth will come out. I fundamentally believe that. Yeah, so I don't believe I've said anything today to make it seem as though none of that were true. That's all I have to say about that.
Okay, so I want to speak briefly to three things. I really appreciate the other comments on this, which do actually demonstrate one thing I was going to say. Part of what was raised just now is that everything we disagree with, we try to violently shut it down. Okay, we have differences. I'm not trying to violently shut them down, okay? This is actually, there's an incredible import. Both of them have spoken to this. For honest, robust, intellectual debate, exploration of differences, and coming together where we can unite against a common enemy. I will say there are some debates that are settled or should be settled. There are some things that if you endlessly debate, it's a myth that everything should always be up for debate, and you should always extend a respectful invite to every idea and every proponent of an idea. Look, white supremacy ought to be a settled question. Charles Murray's, to take one specific example, Charles Murray, there's other examples that could be given. Charles Murray's theories were debunked before he published the bell curve, okay? They were debunked for many, many years. There is no genetic basis for race. There is no scientific correlation between somebody's intellectual capacity and IQ tests. These things are debunked. The only reason the man has a platform is because his white supremacist biodeterminist notions, anti-scientific notions, debunked pseudoscience, actually are very useful to institutions and a system that has white supremacy built into it. So there is a reason why the bell curve was promoted at the same time that Clinton was trying to end welfare as we know it and ramp up the 1996 crime bill. It was very politically useful. Okay, so we can't abstract, A, they're completely anti-scientific, and B, it is morally harmful. It does real damage to real people. Millions of lives have been destroyed behind the pseudoscientific white supremacist notions. Okay, that's a fact. And it doesn't advance discourse to continue to entertain that any more than it would advance discourse to bring a flat earther in to lecture in your science department. It's debunked, it's invalid, and if every student had to learn the theory of flat earth, you would not be learning, it would stand in the way of advancing real science. So it's a myth. I think we need a tremendous amount of discourse and debate, including among people who disagree, but not over things like white supremacy, misogyny, and biodetermined misogyny, or the notions of biblical fundamentalism, that women are no more than possessions of their husbands and incubators, okay? Or the kind of fascism. Fascism should also be a settled question. So we should unite to actually oppose the imposition of those things on humanity. We don't need debate with white supremacy. We need debate over how to understand it and take it on. We don't need debate with fascism and fascists, but over how to understand it and take it on. And we should have room for a lot of differences among us in that process. Second, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
You want to interject?
No.
Second, Okay, hold on, man. We're speaking here. Second, you impugned a lot of violence to us, and I said repeatedly, and I know everybody heard me, and I know you heard me too, I am calling for mass nonviolent political protest. When we talk about what a revolution is, we can get to that. But I just want to say, let's not pretend we're sitting in some nonviolent bubble. I gave a presentation. Donald Trump said, I want to punch that protester in the face. Donald Trump said, twice joked about the political assassination of his opponent, Hillary Clinton, invoking the Second Amendment. If you really were sincere in your opposition to using terror and violence to shut down people's views, then you would be joining in a protest movement to drive out this regime, which is the violent enemy of people who want to raise their differences in a legitimate fashion. Third, and I will end this because I want to hear other voices that are here. Third, I want to say, you posed, look, there's a lot of lies that people have been taught about communism. I'm a communist. I'm an advocate of the new synthesis of communism developed by Bob Avakian. We have an excellent series debunking the lies about communism that we're featuring at revcom.us, which I invite people to go look at. I don't want to take the time tonight on that because it's not the main topic that we came together to discuss. But I will say to the notion that people who lived under communism were forced to do so, but people under imperialism are not forced to. I'm sorry, nobody in Iraq, the 1 million who were killed and the 5 million who were displaced, none of them had a vote on whether the U.S. would invade, okay? Nobody in Mexico right now has a vote over whether the U.S. is going to build a wall. You know, nobody in Bangladesh had a vote over whether the U.S. is going to deregulate 30 environmental regulations, accelerating environmental climate change, and Bangladesh is going to be underwater and millions of people's lives will be destroyed. Let's not pretend that everybody has a choice who is affected by capitalism, imperialism. The premise is false. The choice that we do have, and I invite people, we should debate our differences, you should learn about genuine communism, everybody here. But even if you don't want to learn about that, we should come together. The choice we have right now is whether we're going to unite and confront a very big danger that's hurtling at humanity, or whether we're going to sit passively and quibble with each other and frankly disassociate because there's anti-communism. And people like this want to play on it. Oh, don't work with yes, communists were involved and refused fascism. We should come together in this process. So that's all I want to say.
Yeah, let's get out of this more time. Well, I'm happy to talk with you afterwards.
Yeah.
Hi. Yeah. I had one question originally. Now I have kind of a two-part question after this gentleman. My first part was you said that with the airport protests. I'm from Buffalo, New York, and I was involved in the protest there in Buffalo as well. I was working with refugees at the time. But you're saying that the protest November 4th, you want to keep it sustained day after day. But then how now that we're kind of seeing like almost this fatigue, right?
Yeah.
People are like, there's so many problems. There's DACA, there's refugees. It's almost day after day is a new problem. We can't really seem to focus on one. So I guess trying to use two examples here too is like from the Women's March compared to like the Occupy movement, which are two great movements that I both saw. Mm-hmm. But when I went to the Women's March, I saw a lot of people go, take pictures with their signs, take some selfies, and then go home. Whereas like on the Occupy March movement, you had a lot of people staying there day after week and got a lot of criticism for kind of maybe being ambiguous or not being direct with their point. So I'm guessing the question is for me on November 4th, how do we kind of play that middle ground where people have enough purpose to stay out day after day, to occupy, you come back out, but also be direct in their meaning and direct what they're angry with, where it doesn't become ambiguous or lost with that. And then the second part of that, because I came a little late, but I didn't hear any talk of revolutionary communist overthrow or violence or Marxism until this gentleman from Refused Marxism, which I'm guessing may be cultural Marxism, is what you might yeah, okay. Anyways, I diddle around on YouTube a bit and listened to these echo chambers for a while, and I heard a lot of the talking points that I heard reiterated again and again. But what I'm really worried about is I hear a lot of talking points being reiterated that this is going to be like a violent, communist, civil war overthrow, which is obviously bogus, which is completely bogus. Yeah. But are you worried at all about those echo chambers that are bringing guns, that are ready to fight, that are ready to use violence in the name of democracy or whatever ludicrous mean that they have? Because really they're not just targeting, people of color or people who are of homosexuality, but also people who are on the left. They've kind of grouped them into one vile, evil group that, I mean, if you look into some of the worst comments, people are ready to wipe out. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm not saying that there is going to anything happen, but is there any worry or precaution being taken place from obvious violent, people coming?
I can answer the first one. So I'll leave you to answer the second one because it deals specifically with November 4th. But to the first point, that's something I've also thought a lot about. And the ways in which protest is absorbed is a word that's been used a lot today. I think it's a really good word. And fetishized and employed as a myth by the very people we're protesting against. And you mentioned the history, the way in which, at the time, the Black Panthers and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and Huey Newton and all of these heroes were seen as, examples of the destruction of America, and how that's the same language being used on us, people like us now. And I think that's but the important point is that now conservatives and anti-blacks and white supremacists will trot out Martin Luther King and will trot out the protest tradition of this country, which Tim knows is better than anyone, is so important and so beautiful, but it's used, it's taken and it's neutered and neutralized and used as a way of perpetuating the status quo. And I think I share the same concerns as you. Not about November 4th, about the Women's March and about the ways in which performative allyship and performative social change is something that's unfortunately, I think, been created by, again, the very people that we're trying to protest against as a straw man, an easy target, an easy way to let us get our steam out. And I guess the answer to that, sustainability is, and I hope you can talk more about this, the importance of sustainability and the importance of different ways of sustainability, that it is not, hopefully this will be the culmination, November 4th, and that would be the dream, is to see that all the work we've been doing so far culminate in that. And in the meantime, how can we sustain this? I don't want us all to walk away after tonight and wait until November 4th. That's not how it's going to work. It has to be sustainable through every facet of every point of our life. And that's the key, I think.
So a couple of things there. First of all, thank you for your work in the airport protests. That was profoundly important and will continue to be, I have no doubt. So a couple of things. First, in terms of the sustainability piece, I was on a panel in a session on Saturday with a bunch of queer activists from across the generations, and one of them, my friend Sue Hyde from Cambridge, who has for 30 years run the Creating Change Summit and convening for the National LGBTQ Task Force. And one of the things that she said, I have a 10% plan. I have a 10% plan. She said, why? We know that there's about 28 to 32% of the population that is never going to be offended by Trump, right? He could burn kittens, right? After performing abortions while reading the Bible and enslaving the White House staff. He could do all sorts of things, and 28% of the country is never going to move on that. And so that's neither here nor there. They're there, but she said, why can't 10% of the American public be out in the streets every day? It doesn't have to be the same 10% every day or every week. Right? Why can't, we have a Monday crew and a Tuesday crew and a Wednesday crew, right? And folks who can leave their jobs, who can do that work. Obviously not everyone can, because people don't have the same kind of flexibility and scheduling and so forth and so on. And so let's work with everybody's schedules. And she said it felt very practical to me. I was like, yeah, why can't 10% of the population be out on the streets every day or every week in a sustained way? Because sustaining the work is hard. Turning the movement or the moment into a movement is the biggest challenge historically for any social movement, right? Turning those movement moments into movements themselves. And every generation has struggled with this, and every generation has met that challenge in different ways and has different lessons to draw from the work that they did. And so, and we can talk for hours about this, and we talk a lot about it in the class. The second thing I want to say is about Occupy. versus the Women's March, or in relation to the Women's March, right? Because I think it's a really important point. I mean, I do think that the Women's March was doing a particular thing that changed over time because the leadership changed over time and they got clarity and a platform and so forth. And I know a lot of the women who were involved in that work at the national level, and they were an extraordinary group of women, contentious, diverse, right? They did a lot of work to get that march from where it started to where it ended up. And that was doing a particular kind of political work in that moment that was absolutely essential and that showed the world that this was not okay for a lot of us. And led by women, and I agree with you that grab him by the genitals video got him elected or helped to get him elected, but I also think that the fact that he got elected because of that has unleashed in the society a larger power among women in particular, and also allies who are there in solidarity, that we haven't seen in a very, very long time. Certainly not, I don't think it's really since the 70s and 80s. And so, but the Occupy movement did sustain itself, and that's precisely why it was ultimately destroyed. Right, why the repression came and the state violence came and the camps were destroyed and the police presence increased and so forth. And so and that's not to say the Occupy movement was a failure. I actually don't believe it was. I'm not saying that. I want to be clear about that because sometimes I get misinterpreted. I think it was actually quite successful in all sorts of ways, but the reason that it ultimately led experienced the kind of state repression that it did was precisely because it sustained itself so bravely for so long in those occupied spaces, which were themselves already occupied spaces, so let's be clear about that. And Wall Street especially, multiple occupations going on in that way. But that's, I think, a lesson for us to learn from, right, is that when we start to sustain things, the danger grows, and that's real. And Martin Luther King understood that, right? All of the folks who were assassinated during those moments, not just in the 60s and 70s, but going back through history, understood the perilousness of sustainability of movements. And then the last point, I'll be very quick, is this issue of violence. And again, let me just be clear, since it's important for me to do so, that I've never advocated violence against anyone in my life, nor have I practiced it. And that's an important thing to state publicly right now, as both a past practice and an ongoing precedent and promise, that's important. But the fact of the matter is that I don't, as much as I am a nonviolent person and a pacifist in practice, I also do not fear violence, because this work is violent. This work is a response to violence. We live in a world that is marinated, drowning in violence. And so if we're going to engage this work and we're going to sustain the work that we do, we are going to place ourselves in peril. And that's one of the reasons why the vast majority of people don't do this work. Why radicals at any given time in history are always the maligned, marginalized, misunderstood minority. Because they understand that it is to engage in protest, to engage in organizing, to engage in any challenge of speaking truth to power, to institutions of privilege, is to engage in perilous work. And that's real. Every single person that I have studied who's been a radical kind of icon of a movement, who's been assassinated, knew the assassination was coming. Harvey Milk literally dictated his last will and testament into a tape recorder in the year before he was shot and killed. There are letters where Martin Luther King meditates on this, and Malcolm X and Medgar Evers and so many others, John Brown, all of those letters that I've read and documents, I think. So there is, I'm not saying that, invite it, court it, right? Look for it, but know that it's lurking, because it always is.
Well, I have to say, there's so much to talk about that you guys have touched on that I would love to respond to and that people have brought up. So I'm gonna try to harness and focus, but it's a pretty it's an important question you raised, and it's a deep and a rich discussion. I want to say, without trying to back into doing any assessment or summation of Occupy or the Women's March or any of this in a deep way, I want to say they were very important, all of them, including the airport protests. And I also want to echo the shout out for being there, and everybody who was there. Actually, it has made a difference. I don't think we would have seen 3 courts blocking these this ban without that. At the same time, without what we're calling for on November 4th and the movement that launches, we're not going to hold on to that victory. That's the nature of fascism. There's a lot to draw from in the Women's March in the kind of way that people felt they could bring their children, that they wanted to be there. They wanted to tell their grandchildren that they were there. They wanted, and it's true there was a dimension where a lot of people came, and it became a weekend with your girlfriends, and you took your selfie and all that. But where that goes is, I don't think we should be at all dismissive of what that opens up. And where that goes is not determined. That could be one moment and they checked it off and then they assuaged themselves. Oh, I did my part and I can live my life. But I don't think that's what mainly motivated people. That could be the opening up of something that becomes much deeper and more widespread. A lot of that depends on what we do. What makes November 4th sustainable? What makes it something I think actually is prescriptive to this catastrophic diagnosis we're facing is it has a concrete demand. It's this regime must go. This nightmare must end. The Trump-Pence regime must go. And we will put our bodies in the streets, maybe just every Thursday, maybe other people every Tuesday, maybe every day. Maybe you get into it and you realize, you know what, my school can wait. I'll take the semester off, or my this or my that. Or maybe you come at night. You know what I mean? People come whenever they can come, but we keep coming back and we keep drawing in more people until our demand is met. And we do that because this is what history is pivoting on. And that's what this is about. It's very important. So there's more to say there, but the concreteness and the enormous difference this will make, the horror of what happens if we don't, and the beauty of what can emerge if we do. That's why it's sustainable with this concrete demand. Your second point, just to fill people in, he raised, look, if you go into the echo chambers of the conspiracy theory, alt-right, fascist websites, people like Alex Jones, who are lunatics but also have the ear of the president, which is part of what makes you know you should take this moment very seriously. They're churning out a lot of lies saying, oh, November 4th, this is their headlines, November 4th, Antifa is declaring civil war. That's literally what you'll find if you go look on Alex Jones's site. That's what he's talking about. And tons of other sites, yes. This is bald-faced lies, distortions, conspiracy theories, lies. But it's not just, like, we live in the era of fake news. A lot of shit can be published on the web, and people have conspiracy lunacy. But this is not just that. I would like to say that this is two things about it. One, there is a recognition among some of these fascist forces that there is a very potent strength to this movement and this vision and this strategy of November 4th, and they are very determined to scare people away from it. Precisely because it provides a vehicle that people don't have otherwise to act in a mass way from different perspectives with different focuses that matter most to them, but recognizing it's the regime that's the problem. And unless we deal with that, all these other things are going to continue to worsen. So they recognize this is actually strategically very powerful and are trying to scare people away too. The fact that right now it is a viable threat after Charlottesville, and you can see this other places, to actually think, wow, if you go to a protest, some of these Nazis and lunatics might show up and do real harm. That itself should not be a reason to stay away. That is actually a small taste of what the future holds for everybody. If we don't, not just for protesters, for everybody, if we don't stand up and stop this before it goes any further. Like I said, this was summoned from the top. This was called forward by Trump. He looked at Charlottesville and said, those are fine people out there with torches. If we don't stand up and stop this now, that's the future. So that's, it's more reason to, and the last thing I want to say about this, echoing Tim, look, we're not courting a confrontation. We are planning nonviolent political protest, and we want to defuse and not allow provocations to throw us off our mission. At the same time, we have to be prepared that you never win a struggle against huge, powerful, entrenched forces of injustice without sacrifice. The question becomes, in the face of that, do you call forward even more people to say, look, maybe part of how, if you go back before Occupy got crushed, part of how Occupy took off, it was going for a little while, And it was on a certain level, and it was pretty cool. I mean, I thought it was exciting. I went down there, but it was actually when it really took off was when video went out around the world of those orange nets being thrown over a group of young female protesters and pepper spray being put in their face at close range. And then all of a sudden, people said, well, I wasn't sure I was with them before, but holy crap, this is outrageous. And they grew, and they spread all over the country. And this is the dynamic in every struggle. We're going to get hit by things, by lies, by slander, by fake news stories, by physical assault. Hopefully not, but that might happen. But then in the face of this, if we stay strong and we call forward more people, that's actually the process through which you grow. And finally on this, what we model in terms of our morality, as we stand together with our differences and our diversity, as we come out and we refuse to be provoked in the streets together, that is a model of the future we're fighting for. We don't agree on everything, but we don't want this nightmare. And that itself is a force of contrast. People see the ugliness hurled against us, and they see who we are and what we're fighting for. That is an attractive force. That's how we're going to grow. And that's part of how we can win.
So I wanted to read a point that somebody who said they couldn't stay but wanted to raise. And she says she's living in Belgium, and she's French-speaking, so sorry for my spelling faults. I'm here for 1 week training at Harvard Law School. I came in this building by coincidence just because I saw a poster for this debate at the entrance door, but I wish to let a comment. First, thank you very much for your speeches, very interesting. Second, I'm glad to see that there are voices in the U.S. that protest against the current way your authorities, President, Congress, etc., are governing today. In Europe, we were stupefied by Trump's election. Yeah. And today, we don't understand how Trump could take his decisions so dangerous, irresponsible, and irrational for the world so easily and so fast. Is there a real democracy in the U.S.? Question mark. This situation is very stressful for most of the world. Yeah. Seen from the outside, the U.S., the American population, looks as sheep, meaning in French that it seems to follow its fate without protesting. The consequences of the current presidency's decisions are so grave for you, U.S. citizens, and for the rest of the world. What will it degenerate? Not sure exactly what she meant by that, but we get the gist. Mm-hmm. So I'm glad to see that initiatives are taken to yell publicly and express your opinions and your disagreements. This reassures me, and I will certainly let this know around me, my friends, while I'll be back in Europe. I wish you a lot of success. I wish you the best. Christine. So, a couple more questions?
Thanks. I'm Jed Schwartz. I'm from Somerville. I just have a few comments. Many white women are not feminists, especially in the rural areas, and probably are neglected by their men, and majority of them voted for Trump. Rural voters resent liberal policies and believe that the Democrats are responsible for advancing the civil rights agendas and therefore are opposed to everything that liberals stand for because they blame them. They're at the bottom third of the status hierarchy. The only thing that they had was feeling superior to black people. Mm-hmm. And the Democrats have been trying to take that source of narcissism away from them. That's what we're up against. I heard also from a friend who spoke with a Chinese fellow here, that is a fellow, I think he was at the Ash Center, who was Chinese last spring. And he said this friend of mine said to him, it was over in the penthouse in the Kennedy Center, said to him, "So what do you think of the new president?" And he said, "We need Mr. Trump." And I said, "You can't expect," I mean, he said, you can't expect us, the man is practically an idiot and an airhead. You can't expect us to stick with him. He said, "We need Mr. Trump." So that's something to consider. Remember that in the early years of the Nazi movement, there was an alliance between Stalin and Hitler. They had, and incidentally, they were very interested in Fordist policies. Fordist policies, you recall, involved paying auto workers more than the market required. Now they're not interested in that anymore because they want to drive wages down in order to get develop OECD jobs. Anyway, in 1968, this room would have been jammed to the rafters, but isn't. I mean, there's hardly anybody here. I mean, you don't want to call for massive demonstrations if nobody's going to show up. You might not want to. You might want to reconsider calling for massive demonstrations if there's only going to be a smattering of people. Anyway, you need to convince the media to cover any demonstrations that occur because they seem to have a bias against doing anything like that. And Mr. Oliver, do you prefer injustice you were criticizing the pursuit of social justice. Do you prefer the pursuit of injustice, perhaps? Or would you just say that what is preferable to the pursuit of social justice is let the market decide? And if that's the case, which I strongly suspect you believe, since most right-wing people believe that, are you aware that markets are strongly influenced by media advertising?
Okay.
Okay,
We're gonna take it up here. You wanna?
That's enough.
Let me say one thing, and maybe then we'll get you. Other people here too. You said a lot of stuff. I'm going to respond to a couple of points. One, absolutely, there's a deep well of white supremacy, misogyny, and don't leave out American chauvinism. America first. This is what Trump rode to the victory, even though he lost the popular vote, let's not forget. But he rode that to victory, and that's what we're dealing with. And I just think, look, it's horrendous. It's dangerous. But these people who think this way have no right to determine and impose that on the future and on humanity. And we have a responsibility to stop them. This is not exactly what you were raising, but it's something that comes up a lot. People often ask, I get told this all the time, how do we reach those people? How do we appeal to them? They're so, the Trump supporters. It's hard to talk with them. We're so polarized. And I want to say our job is not to go out and win them over and to seek dialogue and common ground with them. Our job is to stop the imposition of a nightmare on humanity. And I think there's a lot of lessons from the civil rights movement. When people went down to the South to register voters or to stand up against the lynchings and the other terror, they didn't go down there to start a dialogue with the Klansmen. They went down there to stop a nightmare. And in the course of that, they put their bodies on the line, and it didn't start with 1 million people. It started with handfuls of people who felt very lonely for a very long time. If you read something like that, Coming of Age in Mississippi, or you watch some of the documentaries, people were down there toiling in these movements before they became mass movements. We watched the 60s. I didn't participate in the 60s, but I watched it. I learned about it through the documentaries, the highlights reel, and you think every day everything was happening. A lot of times there was really small meetings. The anti-war movement was small, and there'd be a hardcore, and they'd be working, and they'd be working, and they'd be working, and then something would happen, and a lot of people would pour in and join with them. Look, a handful of people. Oh, I didn't finish my first point. I'll make the point, and then I'll make the second point. They went down in the civil rights movement to stop a horror. But in the course of doing that and putting their bodies on the line to do that, not only did they stop and help dismantle Jim Crow, They actually reached more racist white Southerners and changed more hearts and minds than they ever would have if they'd gone to seek a dialogue. They didn't win everybody over, but they actually did win over some of the youth. And it was because because people started to say, what do they know? What do they understand that they feel so strongly about? That they're going to put their bodies on the line behind it that I don't understand. And people started to consider that. Not everybody, but that's the point. Is we got to get out of this thing of trying to seek dialogue with people who are unleashed around genocidal program. We have to stop that genocidal program, that fascist program. And in the course of that, as an ancillary, you actually have a better chance of winning some of them over. So that's the first point. The second point I'll make very briefly, which is, oh my God, it went away. Maybe a few people, and I meant to bring this up in my speech, and I went off the page. Chelsea Manning. This is another example. I can't let the night go at Harvard and not use her name. Chelsea Manning, war on freedom of expression, war on free speech. What was done here on this campus to revoke the fellowship of Chelsea Manning because the head of the CIA didn't like it? That is the thought police. That is the closing down of space for discourse. But Chelsea Manning is also an example of how one person who acts with courage and conviction can have a huge impact and galvanize others. Don't ever forget, and we shouldn't let it be erased, that Chelsea Manning exposed war crimes, crimes against humanity, and by doing that had a huge impact on many, many people standing up against the wars and other people blowing the whistle. And right now, I'm with you, I wish this room was packed to the rafters, and I wish it was packed with a lot of young people and students. There needs to be more undergrads. I'm glad you're here, but there need to be a lot more. Everybody who's here is in the right place, but I wish there was more people. But I don't want to underestimate what a handful of people can do if you're telling the truth, the undiluted truth about an emergency, and you're willing to go out there and sound the alarm and give others who are agonizing and feel isolated and powerless a sense that we have a vehicle and we have a way to act together. Don't underestimate what a handful of people can do, even in a very telescoped period of time when everybody can tell that huge changes are afoot.
Can I add two things here? One is, I heard someone snarkily quip when we were up getting food that, well, if this is all the people who care about free speech at Harvard, we're in trouble, right? And I just think that you can't read one room and have that be representative of whatever moment we're living in. I've been in 15 rooms in the last week, and they've been ranging from this crowd and even smaller to crowds of 1,000 people. So, if I had focused on the room of the 1,000 people, I'd think we're in a great space and everybody cares about the thing we were talking about then, and that nobody cares about the stuff we're talking about now. I have 15 or 20 people who wrote me emails today, said, I can't come, sounds like a great event, will it be videotaped? So, there are lots of people who aren't in this room, and I don't think you can take the population of one room and sort of extrapolate it out into some representation of a whole movement moment. The other thing I want to say about Chelsea Manning, and this speaks to how the university can be a battleground. So I was supposed to be the person who interviewed Chelsea Manning in the forum at the Kennedy School when she came as a fellow for the Institute of Politics, which would have been the first time we'd had a transgender, openly transgender, self-identified transgender person in the IOP. So I was very upset that Chelsea Manning did not ultimately get to come as a fellow. But what we should know is that one of the things that's been amazing is that, I teach Kennedy School students every day, and the outpouring of outrage over the rescinding of the invitation to Chelsea Manning was remarkable. And this is not just outrage among the queer students and the left-wing students and the anti-war students. This was outrage from military, active duty military people who were more conservative than not. There was a widespread, I actually quipped to the dean the morning after he rescinded the letter. I talked to him on the phone for about 45 minutes, and I said, you do realize that yesterday only half the world hated you, now everyone does? And he said, is that true? And I said, it might be. And we had that moment. But what happened was, because of that moment, there have been a whole bunch of other moments where we're in conversation with the Institute of Politics to bring transgender fellows to the Kennedy School. This has opened up a whole set of possibilities for funding to create spaces at the Kennedy School where we can have conversations about how queer identities intersect with the public policy debates that we're having at the school. And then Tuesday, after the rescinding of the invitation, 50 plus of us met with Chelsea Manning in the Democracy Center. because she was here, and we talked to her about the things she would have said in the forum, and we set up an opportunity and an ongoing dialogue to try to figure out another way to bring Chelsea Manning to this institution. And so I think it's important for us to highlight the CIA influence and the ways in which the Kennedy School dean was influenced in that particular moment, but I also think it's really important to understand that there's a bigger story here. There's a bigger story that's beyond Chelsea Manning and Dean Elmendorf's rescinding of her fellowship invitation, that there's a story about the pretty widespread outrage about that decision at the Kennedy School, the opportunity lost for her to come and have a whole set of conversations with us about things we never talk about at the Kennedy School, including whistleblowing and how people muster up the moral courage to do something like that. And we also, it's opened up a set of discussions among different kinds of folks at the Kennedy School that never would have happened about trans issues and queer representation and spaces for radicals in that space, and how maybe sometimes those spaces should be at the Democracy Center and not the Forum. And maybe the kinds of conversations we can have at the Democracy Center and in other spaces that we constitute and organize ourselves are actually more robust spaces and more interesting and compelling spaces than the sort of the more formal and institutional spaces that sometimes the schools privilege, right, but often become spaces where certain kinds of dissenting positions are actually marginalized, if not silenced.
Just real quick, I don't have much to say, but I wanted to respond to your first point because I think it's so, because I think it's so important. And it's not enough, I mean, there's one conversation about intersectionality that of course must be had, but I want to focus on the speech aspect of what we're talking about and how it intersects with what you were just talking about. And it goes to something that I was mentioning earlier. And I mentioned why I thought, through pure speculation, Open Campus Initiative invited Charles Murray. It is not about ideology. The reason I do not believe that the reason why white supremacy is so systematically entrenched in our society is because of ideology. That's not what's going on. What's going on is power, and what's going on is, like you said, people are facing existential threats with the way that they thought the world worked being undermined. They're facing a loss of control of themselves and of the world, and that's terrifying. And I guarantee you, like, white supremacy is like in the air I breathe at this school. Like, it is everywhere. And it is not because every white person I come up to believes that I am intellectually stunted or morally decrepit. That's not what they believe. They're afraid. They're afraid of the fact that I am here taking up space, being loud, and developing myself in this society, and they're afraid that they're losing control. And that's what the free speech debate is about. It's not about ideology, and that's why, at some level, as Sunsara said, debate isn't going to solve the problems, because it's not about what people believe. It's about what people want, and people want power.
Hi. Hey. My name is Mary. I've been working with Refuse Fascism since April, and I just wanted to let everybody know, if you are interested in how November the 4th is going to manifest in Boston, because we have a very active contingent that operates more than twice a week, please come to our regional conference. It's happening on Saturday, the 19th, at the Center for Adult Education on Brattle Street. 21st. I just came from my other job. Sorry, I'm confused. I swore it was the 19th. But anyway, it's the 21st, and it's going to be from 1 to 6 p.m. We're going to talk about everything that we're planning for our manifestation of November the 4th. And some basic idea is we'll go out and we'll do something for a huge portion of the day, and then maybe we'll go back home. But the reason that we call it November the 4th, it begins. It's not, it ends on November the 4th. There's no way to end it in one day. It's going to take time, and it's going to take accumulating people that are willing to say, okay, there's a backing to this. People care about this, and I feel safe to join this group now. It's going to need to build and culminate. So anyway, please come to our conference. Well, we really... It's I already said it's at the Center for Adult Education on Brattle Street, and it's going to be between 1 and 6, and we really need everyone's voices, because obviously we want a lot of ideas about how to remove this regime. Personally, another nonviolent person, I would never hurt anybody, but I am willing to lay my life on the line for this cause. I'm willing to go to rallies that I'm afraid someone might drive a car into me, because it matters. This is the future of the world. This is history happening around us. And I'm not afraid to get punched or maced. I will go to everything I can go to. And if you can make it, we want to have you there to help show people that there are people that care, regardless of how small we might start.
Hello. Do you agree that Trump isn't necessarily evil itself or the nightmare, but just the beginning of the nightmare? Or do you feel also that people, if he were to get impeached or Pence impeached or whatever, that people want a Barack Obama era policies would be okay with that instead of
Can you just restate what was your point about if he gets impeached and then something about Obama?
I'm sorry, like people would happily go back to Obama.
I see.
Yeah.
So no, so that's a great point, and it's definitely the former. And it's not just Trump is not a new problem. What we're facing now is unprecedented levels, but like, as Tim has said, and as Sunsara has said, like white supremacy and the white patriarchy and the class structure is embedded in him. It's what America's built on, and it's what like modern society is built on. And so that's a really good question that I think this event is rightfully focused on the Trump-Pence regime, because like that is the pressing, like that is what we need to do before we are in a complete fascist state. But then we have to answer the deal with the next question, which is then what? How do we move forward? Because if we throw out Trump and Pence, then we're back to where we started, which was not great. Like the Obama years were not great for a lot of people. And so I thank you for bringing that up, and that's something we always need to keep in mind.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. As Naomi Klein's written a great new book called "No Is Not Enough," and I think the third page of the introduction, she said Trump's a culmination of 40 years of assaults on values and institutions and people and lives and so forth. And so that said, I think he's a nightmare. I think he's a total fucking nightmare, and I'm going to name that. I grew up in New York, and I remember at the breakfast table when I was a teenager in the 80s, like listening to my parents talk about this slimeball real estate developer in New York who was like doing all sorts of crazy stuff with supermodels, and the Central Park 5 case where I've known that Donald Trump is a white supremacist, racist, misogynist pig who also probably has paid for some abortions and gone to some gay marriages and supported Democratic politicians since I was a teenager. And so he's an absolute nightmare. He himself represents a nightmare, and then he's also a culmination of some of the more nightmarish forces that are operating in our society. But I also think he's at once the beginning of this, right? I mean, we're living through a nightmare right now, and how long it will last is up to us.
So I really agree with both of those comments. I just want to add, for myself, I want to get rid of the whole system. I am a communist revolutionary, and I am fighting to bring closer, preparing the people, preparing the ground, and preparing the vanguard to get ready for a time when millions can be led to go all out, to seize power, to overthrow the system, and establish a new socialist republic. And Bob Avakian published a constitution for the new socialist republic. That's the world I would like to see. Having said that, as a communist revolutionary, I recognize that right now we have to deal with, there's a stage of the revolution, we have to deal with what this regime is imposing. If we don't do that, you are not getting closer to a revolution. At the same time, I protested Obama, and I thought, he was a war criminal. I will say Hillary was a war criminal. I didn't support any of them. But if you were a Hillary supporter, if you loved Barack Obama and you want to go back to that, because Trump is worse, if you want that, let's stand together in opposing this now. Because there's no future that's good for any of us and for humanity if this regime gets consolidated and imposed. And we should have robust debates and disagreements as we stand shoulder to shoulder against this. And I'm very proud that in Refuse Fascism, there are people who threw their lives into campaigning for Hillary. And I've sat next to them. We were in Berkeley protesting Milo Yiannopoulos together. There's people who were for Bernie. There's people who were never political before in their lives. We should have differences among us, and we should be able to rise above that and come together, because that's what history demands of us. So I want to make clear, as much as I agree, I'm like 100% with your statement about Obama, but I want to invite everybody in, because we need each other right now.
And I also just want to say one other quick thing, is that we're not going back to Obama. Obama's over. Like, we're not going back to Obama, and Hillary Clinton is never going to be president of the United States. So, like, let's not... we have too many, I'm not saying you're saying that, but like we have too many realities that we have to confront now without going through like some kind of like intellectual acrobatics about like, well, would we prefer to go back to Obama or deal with this menace? This is what we have to deal with. There's no going back to Obama. And I say that as someone who worked on his 2008 campaign. I was an LGBT advisor for Obama. I worked on Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign, and I don't apologize for that. I am considerably to the left of either of them. I was deeply, deeply disappointed in Barack Obama's presidency on a whole range of issues. But if you were to say to me, you know, could I go back 4 years from now? Hell yeah, I would like to, but I ain't gonna, because none of us are, right? We're moving forward, or we're perishing from the earth. So those are our choices.
You know, he also mentioned, I'll be very brief, he mentioned impeachment and Pence.
Yeah.
Pence, you are right. I don't want to lose that. Pence is a nightmare himself. That's why we say the Trump-Pence regime. Pence, the only difference between Mike Pence...
Go ahead.
The only difference between Mike Pence and the Taliban is about 6,000 miles and how they name their god.
I totally agree with that. I totally agree with that. But I will say, I will take Pence any day over Trump as long as we're going there, because that is a possibility. I'll tell you why. Because I'm a queer person who has been fighting the culture wars in the LGBTQ movement since the AIDS crisis. And Tom Pence is the devil I know well. Tom Pence is the brother
Pence.
I have been fighting for 30 years. I know every page out of his book. Bring me Mike Pence. Donald Trump is a wrecking ball that I have no idea what to do with, and I am struggling mightily to figure that out.
I cannot agree with that, but this is why, hey, it's encompassed in taking on the whole regime. We can have that discussion.
Yeah, no, totally.
It's encompassed in taking on the whole regime.
Get rid of them all.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This is really, really powerful. I just have a fast comment. You read Neumeyer thing. I went out to a few years back to Anne Frank's house, where she basically, well, the curators basically described the race of fascism from the beginnings to, you know, the extermination of millions of people and all of that stuff. And I see it so clearly in what is happening now. I grew up in a dictatorship. I'm from the DR, the Dominican Republic. I know how that feels. I know how it feels when you're brushed with the communists, because I saw some of my friends being killed because they were brushed as communists. So I know how that feels. Yeah. And being from Latin America, we have lost a lot of intelligentsia because of communism and all of that stuff. Just the perception, not the reality, the perception of that. So I have a lot of stuff inside of me, and I have worked a lot to try to deal with that. What I would not do is to allow you to get punched on the face. And I will just stay back. Because if I see that, I will intervene, and I'll promise you that. I live in violence, and I know how to conduct violence myself. So for you fellow out there, and for the cops that I post a lot about, I will not tolerate a cop beating up someone in front of me without intervention. And that is a promise. And I threw something out to, if I ever see a cop abusing someone in front of me, I will hold you accountable. That's right. I go through the law if I have to go through the law, and if I have to chase you myself, I will do that. So that's what I'm at. So I don't pull back on violence. I will not tolerate someone abusing someone in front of me just because of the principles of it, because they count on that. Yeah. They count and they can get away with that stuff. They count that they will move a car through a crowd and kill someone, and they will not be accountable for that. I will not put up with that. Thank you.
I want to say, in these protests that we are calling for, and we have different views among us about, you know, the question of violence and whether it's ever legitimate and in what forms. And there are pacifists among us, and there are those who feel like you do. And I'll say for myself, not all violence is the same. Right. The violence of the rapist is oppressive violence. The violence of the Nazi who drives a car through a crowd of nonviolent protesters is oppressive violence. The violence of this state terrorizing and raiding immigrant families is oppressive violence. The violence of somebody standing up and fighting against the rapist and even beating them to free themselves from that is not oppressive violence. That's a liberating violence. And they're not all the same. That's my view. And in these protests, we are not initiating violence. They are nonviolent protests, but we recognize as a movement, that doesn't mean everybody has to play the same role in this, but as a movement that people have the fundamental and the moral right to self-defense. And that's different than initiating violence, but it's very important. And I really love that you will not let her be punched in the face. And that is part of our morality. I'm not saying in this that we have to go out there and lay ourselves in front of a beating. That's not what, but we're also not going to let people derail what we're trying to accomplish and be provoked into a confrontation that gives the other side a bigger excuse to clamp down on us. We're going to stand with each other, we're going to have each other's backs, and we're going to look out for each other in that context.
That's right.
Yes. Yes, what's happening in Puerto Rico right now is a genocide. 1/3 of the people who haven't had clean water for 3 weeks, 1/6 of the population without electricity, waterborne diseases spreading, bridges being destroyed, people blocked in the remote areas. It is a genocide. And Donald Trump, the only reason it's being treated that way is because these people are brown and they speak Spanish and they're a colonized people. And it is a genocide, and Donald Trump tweets out, "It's your own fault. It's your mismanagement." No, the U.S. has plundered that colony for generations. That's why they're in debt. And then he tweets out, "We're going to pull out FEMA." I am proud to say that we went to Trump Tower last Friday and we threw the paper towels back at the tower because it is a genocide. Yes, it's true.
No, let's not get in a fight. Let's not
I
get in
know.
a battle.
You're right.
Don't feed the beast.
Hi, sir. I just have a set of brief questions that take the title literally. So what is the response or the responses that you've heard of to the University of Wisconsin effort to have students who disrupt campus speeches to be suspended or expelled? And then relatedly, what would you rather happen when you have folks like Charles Murray come here? Are you asking that they not come here at all? Or are you asking to be heard? And then related to that, if you're asking that they not be invited at all, then what do you respond to folks who say, if we chill their speech, we're chilling our speech?
Yeah. So, okay, good. So first off, if someone may have a more thorough knowledge of the statutes in Massachusetts than I, but to my knowledge, there are statutes on the books that it is illegal to disrupt events in Massachusetts, to my knowledge. So if we were to have stormed into the Murray event and not the space between violence and silence, if we had gotten in that space, we could have been shut down, which I think is something that that's not something I want to see. I don't want to see protests neutered like that, and that's not what I want to see on this campus. And to your second point about what we would want, I guess there's two points. The first is what I, as a black queer person, want, and what I want is Charles Murray to be nowhere near me. I fundamentally am tired of hearing my humanity questioned over and over again. And I think it's perfectly valid for me to assert that.
That's right.
On the other hand, the non-ideal situation is that people like Charles Murray exist. They exist in my day-to-day life. And how then do I go forward with that? And so one of the way we phrased our demand for the Charles Murray event was, we said, the Black Caucus asserted, we do not want this person on campus as black people and as representatives of the black community. But if he were to be here, then you better engage with him. You better do your goddamn best to push him and to refuse to allow him to cover up, because that's what happened. The event was, again, it was on elitism and Trump. So this is a person who's advocated for eugenics, and he was asked to talk about intellectualism. And white supremacy was nowhere near the topic of discussion in their mind. We brought it into the discussion. We asserted it. And that's that's a grievous error on their part. That's a grievous error to the principle of free speech, which is not to be able to say whatever you want without being engaged. It is the principle to be able to get engaged in dialogue. And so, yes, my dream goal would be Charles Murray, other side of the world. In the reality where he is here, I want to be able to look him in the eyes and engage with him. And I want people who have spent years debunking him and working against him to be able to stand up and look him in the eyes and debunk him.
Right. So I'm really glad you brought those questions up, because I think they're vital questions for what we're talking about here, and also the larger debate about the role of the university right now, which I think is changing and is contested. I think there are a lot of different kinds of people who have different ideas about that. I think Nicholas is absolutely right. Like, I don't want Charles Murray anywhere near me, right, or anywhere near us, or anywhere near any of us. But that's not the reality of a university as big as this. That there are people right now at this university saying all sorts of things. And some people think the stuff we're saying is crazy, and we may think the things that other people are saying is crazy, and there may be more people attending one event and less people attending the other event, and the president might be at one event and a faculty dean might be at another event. This happens all the time at universities. And that's actually, I think, one of the things that's the brilliant, beautiful mess of a university, is that there are all these different kinds of people doing different things and saying different things to different people and debating things at the same time. That said, I don't, the fact that the other part of freedom is not free and freedom is not equal is that if anyone's going to come to university, and there are people within that community who feel assaulted or violated or offended or in some way harmed by someone's views or someone's worldview or someone's practices in the world, then you better damn well expect that we're going to show up and we're going to protest. And I think that the Charles Murray stuff that Nicholas and his colleagues organized, and the Betsy DeVos protests that my students at the Kennedy School and the Ed School organized recently, are both examples of the best of what we can do in terms of having universities where there are going to be people we don't like who come to speak. And frankly, I would rather have Betsy DeVos here saying whatever she has to say than somewhere else, and so we have no idea what she's saying. I actually want the terrible Secretary of Education to come to the Kennedy School and have to confront us, and have us be able and free to confront her. And I may have a different opinion than some of my colleagues on the panel or in the room on that issue. I tend to be a real free speech radical. And I am like, if you're going to come, you better be ready to contend, right? It's not just about civil discourse, right? If we can get to that place, great. That's at its best. But contentiousness is part of democracy, right? It's part of earning that freedom that is not free and not equal. And I think that's really very important. One of the things that I worry about with I don't want to be patronizing, but with some of the younger generation is the millennials, is that I have heard many of them, and the most radical among them, who have said, I want us to have speech codes, essentially. And we should be able to determine who comes here and how safe the spaces are and this, that, and the other thing. And not only do I think that's impractical, I think that's really, really difficult and problematic. Because the fact of the matter is, if there are going to be free speech codes, we know historically, we know who are going to be silenced first. I can take my month. Right, I was supposed to interview Chelsea Manning in the forum. Chelsea Manning's invitation was rescinded, so I had to have a conversation with her and my students in an alternative location, right? That was 3 weeks ago. Then tonight, we have this event here, and there was some pressure on this event about whether or not we should have this, and who is sponsoring this, and who are these people who are going to be here, and are they going to be outside agitators, and this, that, and the other thing tonight. Next week, I'm hosting an event at the Carr Center and the Charles Warren Center at the Kennedy School on armed resistance after Charlottesville, and we're already getting pressure not to have that here, and I'm going to be in conversation with Dwayne Dixon, who's a member of Redneck Revolt, with Vince Brown, Lisa McGurr, and me responding to his story and his work, and we're going to do that at the Kennedy School. There's pressure not to have that. That's next week. A week after that, I'm doing a staged reading of Robert Schenken's new play, Building the Wall, at the American Repertory Theater, and there's pressure for us not to do that because he's going right at, in an artistic way, the Trump regime and what we're going through right now. So literally my month has been every week dealing with the forces that are trying to silence the stuff that I'm participating in. And I didn't even get into the stories about the resistance school last year and the resistance school this year and the one-state conference after I came back from Israel and Palestine at the Kennedy School in 2012. So I have spent my life resisting the forces that are trying to silence me. I am not going to become one of the forces trying to silence them.
Okay. First of all, when Building the Wall comes here, people should see it. It's an incredible play. It's an incredible play, and to speak to suppression, it's one of those that the New York Times Theater Review gatekeepers trashed and got it shut down early in New York. It was incredible. It was packed.
I went to the opening.
It got extended three times in LA.
There is the director, Benny.
Oh, hey. When Building the Wall, people got to go see it. It's a very powerful play.
We got to talk after.
It's a very powerful
I know
play.
we did it at Central Square. Yeah, we're doing one at the ART next week. 2 weeks.
Very good. So, but to your question on Wisconsin, there's a pattern in Wisconsin and other places to make it a criminal offense for students and others to disrupt a speaker. This is a fascist law, and it is part of the war on actual expression. And they do it, this is Orwellian, in the name of free speech. Let's just say something. Students who stand up and protesters who stand up and disrupt a speech, especially when the speaker is backed by powerful institutions and is putting forward ideas that are buttressed by hundreds of years of entrenched tradition and are being imposed by the power of the state. People who have that kind of platform, when they are challenged and disrupted by students and protesters who don't have institutional backing, who don't have major funding, who are going up against entrenched authority and going up against the ideas of the state, that's the students' right to free speech is being curtailed.
That's right.
The protesters' right to speech and assembly is being curtailed, and it's being punished. The students at Middlebury were punished. The students at Claremont McKenna, who did nonviolent protest against Heather McDonald's justification for police murder, 5 of them were suspended. People have gone to jail. People are being kicked out of school, and a chill is being put on protest. And I just want to say, look, he used the phrase inequality within the how did you put it?
Freedom is not equal.
Freedom is not equal. Look, we live in a society divided into rulers and ruled, oppressors and oppressed, and it's not. The First Amendment, he read it before. I have so many things to say about this. I've written a lot about this. I've given longer talks. I'm trying to compress. But he quoted the First Amendment, and it's important. It says, Congress shall pass no law restricting speech. The student protesters are not Congress. They're not passing a law. Nobody is trying to make it illegal for Charles Murray to speak. Okay, nobody's trying to make it illegal for Ann Coulter to speak. What I think is right, and I don't speak for everybody and refuse fascism, we have differences, but I think everywhere they show up, people should exercise vigorously their freedom of expression and speech and drive them out of the campus and shut them down and drive them out of power. I think that's our right. I think that's our responsibility. And I'll say one last thing on this. The notion that discourse can only be advanced through polite, pleasant, tame discussion that some institution has sanctioned is a myth. There's a profound history of people standing up against war criminals in the 60s, driving them off the campus, driving the recruiters off the campus, driving the CIA off the campus, driving the Peace Corps off the campus, And frankly, it opens up bigger debate and discourse. It makes people think about ideas that they've never had access to. It's a form in which that people who have relatively little power in society or no power in society can actually rip open a debate and widen understanding. It's a myth that it's somehow antithetical to engagement and debate. And so gets the very final thing, the notion that if people who lack institutional power and backing, who are going up against oppression and entrenched authority, the idea that if people rise up and shut down or drive out fascists who are speaking, that somehow that's why they will be chilled, I don't think that's true. When people have vigorously stood up in the civil rights movement, in the anti-Vietnam War movement, in other struggles, it has actually led to their views being more widely heard. When they, protecting and bowing down to the ability of oppressors and people with the power of the state Protecting their right to speak does not translate into protecting the rights of those who are oppressed to speak. And, you know, it's a very, very important principle that John Stuart Mill brought forward, that people should have. They should hear the ideas put forward by their most ardent advocates. We should hear ideas we disagree with. We should not be so fragile that we can't entertain them and intellectually engage them. But these are the people that I'm talking about, and the ideas being put forward, we are swimming in them. It's a myth that we're sheltering ourselves from them. We live in a world entrenched with this, and what is urgently needed is for people to actually challenge not only those ideas, but the structures and the power behind them.
Can I just say one quick thing about the Wisconsin piece? Because I would like to know the specific language of those laws. We're in a law school. I'm not a lawyer. I'm a historian. But the thing that's interesting is I think the law in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, such as there is one, and private institutions have different ways of getting around this than public institutions. But when people are physically intimidated or confronted, that's where the sort of prohibition. That's where the line of the prohibition is. But one thing to look for, and this is where I'm interested in the Wisconsin example, is there may very well be a sort of broadening of the scope of what it means to disrupt, right? Can you shout down a speaker? Do you come and all form a line around the building in silence and sort of be there as a silent protest to a speaker? Is that going to be included in disruption? If there's something outside, are you subject to some kind of fine, penalty, or arrest if you're merely at the building where the people are going, or at the site where they're doing? So what I would like to and I think we have to be mindful of this in this moment, is whether or not these codes that police protest are being broadened and expanded to include things that are not in any way part of a physical confrontation.
They are.
I think this is something to be, I think, really be mindful of right now, because that's one way that we're going to be able to see the battleground of the university becoming an even more contested terrain moving forward.
Okay, so we are actually past our time, so I would like to give each of the panelists 2 minutes to kind of give concluding remarks.
Oh, God. Oh, Lord. All right. How are we going to do this? You want to?
Let's do something amazing, people. Let's really, really reach inside of ourselves. And everybody heard a lot tonight, and you know 1,000 other horrendous things that have been happening, that you watch your Twitter feed or your Facebook, people send you stuff, or you open the newspaper. I hope you open the newspaper and you get one of these and you see what's happening. And let's be sober-eyed and honest with ourselves about what's happening, and let's not underestimate the impact we could have. And I implore you, if you speak the truth and you act with conviction, and you put yourself on the line behind it, there are a lot of other people who will be able to be one to join with you. And we need that, and humanity needs that from us. And November 4th is a vehicle. And the movement this is launching is a vehicle. And there's a website, refusefascism.org, that's a resource to you. I also write for revcom.us, which is getting into these questions more deeply. We need to work together. We need to learn from each other. We need to keep talking and debating as we go. But more than anything else, in the name of humanity, we need to refuse to accept a fascist America. And that is something we have the power to do. And so let's do something amazing for humanity.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah. Thank you to everyone who organized this event. This is outstanding. And again, I'm honored to be here. I guess the last thing I would say is something that I mentioned at the beginning and didn't talk a lot about, but it's something I've thought a lot about and I've wrote a lot about. What separates really radical progressivism from a status quo, a center-left, perpetuation of the way things are? The outcome is not what matters. I truly believe that. The outcome is what we're aiming for, but that's not what's separating us. What's separating us is who is pushing it, who is taking their voice and using it to change the world. And I look at the people who've organized this panel, and I am stunned by the power and the way in which all of you have asserted your voices under the violence and the pressure of your identities and your being to be silenced. And I think that's what separates this room and what I hope will separate us moving forward from the way things have always been, is we need to take back what is ours, our voice, and we need to assert our own future and our own ideal.
I must say, people talk about being pessimistic all the time now and paralyzed. I am very optimistic about the generation that is emerging in the midst of this madness. So everybody, thanks for having us here and for organizing this, and my fellow panelists. It's been a real pleasure. I just want to say 3 simple things. Do not be afraid. Be brave. And the last 2 words that my late mentor Howard Zinn said to me before he died were carry on.
Before people go, my name is Scott. I'm one of the people that works with Refuse Fascism here in Boston. And if you haven't already had a chance to fill out one of the forms so we can learn about this program, so we can get even better at it in the future, if you could leave your email and phone number, please take a moment and write this down. Okay, I'm going to give you a website that I encourage all of you to go to at some point. If you really want to see what's going on, we've talked about Boston and people have raised questions about Boston, but this is national. People really have to recognize if something doesn't happen in Boston, but on November 5th it explodes in Los Angeles, that's going to have a huge ripple effect across the country. And so check out this website, refusefascism.org. And it will link you up with all these things that we've been talking about. The second, if you already haven't had a chance to endorse the call for the 4th, go online and do so. Third, spread this with your ability through social media of any and all sorts, whether it's still like me and I write letters to my friends, to Twitter, Facebook, and all the others. Please, please. Because what that woman was saying earlier, we're not where we need to be, she's right. We've got to get there. Come to the conference, as Mary was saying, on Saturday. And if you want to speak to Mary or I after, we can give you more details. We are going to be out as a broad blasting, if you will, of November 4th all across the country for the next several days, this weekend into Monday. We're going to be out for a chunk of the day in Harvard Square and Central Square. We're going to be doing that on Tuesday and so forth. So please join us. And lastly, thank you, Phil and Bruce, and our panelists, and Sarah, Nicholas, and Timothy.